For about 100 years, we thought we had the story of America's first people all figured out. It was a story you've probably heard, one that went something like this. Around 13,000 years ago, a group of tough, courageous hunters chased mammoths across a frozen world. It was a good story. It was simple. It made for some really great museum exhibits. The only problem? It might be completely wrong. You see, in just the last few years, a wave of absolutely incredible discoveries has completely smashed that old timeline. These new finds are revealing a civilization thousands of years older, one that's been hiding right under our feet this whole time. This is the story of how we're finding America's first hidden civilization, and why it's forcing us to rethink, everything. For most of the 20th century, the story of how people got to the Americas was simple, elegant, and accepted as fact. It's called the Clovis-First theory, and for decades, it was basically law in the world of archaeology. The story begins back in the 1930s, near the town we still call Clovis, New Mexico. Archaeologists there found something incredible: beautifully made stone spear points, buried right alongside the bones of mammoths and giant bison. Now, these weren't just any spearheads. They had this unique groove, a flute, chipped from the base. It was a clever and unique design that let them attach the point securely to a spear, making it an incredibly deadly weapon. As more and more of these Clovis points turned up all over North America, always found with the remains of Ice Age giants, a powerful picture began to form. The Clovis people were master mammoth hunters. They were the first ones here, and these distinctive tools were their calling card. The timeline seems solid, too. The sites consistently dated to about 13,000 years ago. This fit perfectly with what geologists knew about the Ice Age. At the time, huge ice sheets covered most of Canada. But scientists figured that around 13,500 years ago, a temporary ice-free corridor opened up between the glaciers. The theory was that hunters from Siberia crossed the Bering Land Bridge into Alaska, waited for that corridor to finally open, and then poured south into a new, untouched continent. Armed with their superior Clovis technology, they spread like wildfire, hunting the massive, naive animals into extinction. It was this epic story of adventure and ingenuity. It became the foundation of American archaeology, a story taught in every school and displayed proudly in every museum. If you dared to question Clovis-First, you were questioning the very bedrock of the field. The story was settled. The book was closed. Or so everyone thought. Because quiet little discoveries that didn't quite fit the official story, started popping up. At first, the establishment dismissed them as mistakes, or even wishful thinking, but those little whispers were about to become a roar. The Clovis-First fortress seemed unbreakable. But starting in the 1970s, a few brave archaeologists started finding things that simply shouldn't have been there. One of the biggest and most hard-fought battles took place at a site in southwestern Pennsylvania we now call the Meadowcroft Rockshelter, near the small town of Avella. Starting in 1973, a young archaeologist by the name of James Adavasio began digging there. As he and his team went deeper and deeper below the layers with the expected artifacts, they just kept finding things. In layers of earth that were supposed to be completely empty of human life, they found tools, ancient fire pits, and even tiny, preserved bits of basketry. Adavasio knew this would cause a firestorm, so he was obsessively careful. He ran over 70 radiocarbon dates, bringing in specialists to double-check every single part of his work. The results were staggering. The deepest human layers at Meadowcroft dated back as far as 16,000, maybe even 19,000 years ago. This was thousands of years older than Clovis. It meant people were living in Pennsylvania long before that ice-free corridor was even supposed to have opened. When Adavasio published his findings, the backlash from the archaeological establishment was fierce. He was accused of being a sloppy scientist, of letting his samples get contaminated. For years, one of the main arguments against his work was that groundwater must have washed older carbon down, messing up the dates. Adavasio and his team spent the next 2 decades defending their work. While some still debate the very oldest dates, Meadowcroft is now widely accepted as solid proof of a pre-Clovis America. And it wasn't just Meadowcroft. At a site called Cactus Hill, right on the Nottoway River in Virginia, archaeologists found simple stone points buried under a layer of Clovis tools, with some estimates dating them to between 18,000 and 20,000 years ago. Then, way down in what is now southern Chile, at a site called Monte Verde, near the modern city of Puerto Montt, Another archaeologist, Tom Dillehay, hit the jackpot. Starting in the late 70s, he began to excavate a site that had been perfectly preserved in a peat bog. He found the remains of wooden huts, tools, medicinal plants, and even a child's footprint left in the soft clay. This wasn't just a temporary campsite, it was a village. And the date was a bombshell, 14,500 years old. People were living in a settled community at the very tip of South America 1,000 years before Clovis hunters even showed up in New Mexico. The implications were world-shattering. To get to southern Chile that early, their ancestors had to have entered the Americas thousands of years before that. The ice-free corridor timeline was simply impossible. Dillehay faced the same brutal criticism as Adovasio, but the evidence he presented was just too good to ignore forever. These sites were the first deep cracks in the Clovis-First wall. They hinted at a totally different story, one that didn't start with hunters walking, but with a much earlier, much more mysterious journey. In the 21st century, the dam didn't just crack. It burst. A flood of new discoveries, armed with incredible new technology, washed away the old theory for good. And some of the most powerful new evidence came from something you might not expect, fossilized poop, or coprolites, to be scientific, found in a series of caves in Oregon, known today as the Paisley 5-Mile Point Caves. An archaeologist named Dennis Jenkins decided to use new DNA technology to reanalyze them. The results, published in 2008, were a complete game-changer. His team managed to pull human DNA straight from the coprolites. It was undeniable biological proof of people living in that cave. And the date? 14,300 years old. Even better, the tools found with them weren't Clovis points. They were a completely different style of Western-stemmed projectile points. More sites kept popping up. In a Florida sinkhole in the Ocilla River, a place now called the Page-Ladson site, divers found a 14,550-year-old mastodon tusk with obvious butchering marks on it. At the Cooper's Ferry site, right along the Salmon River in Idaho, tools were found dating back an astonishing 16,000 years. And at the Galt site in the hill country of central Texas, archaeologists have found a staggering number of artifacts, with a human presence that may stretch back as far as 20,000 years, with the most solid evidence dating to around 16,000 years ago. But the most incredible discovery of all came from what is now White Sands National Park in southern New Mexico. In 2019, researchers found thousands of human footprints, perfectly preserved in an ancient, dried-up lakebed. These weren't just impressions. They were stories frozen in time. They found trackways of teenagers and children. Footprints showing someone carrying a toddler, setting them down, and then picking them up again. Kids splashing in the mud. And they were walking alongside giant sloths and mammoths. The dating, however, was what caused an earthquake in the field. Scientists dated seeds embedded right in the footprints to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. This was so much older than anything that had ever been accepted that it was met with intense but understandable skepticism. Critics argued that aquatic plants could absorb old carbon from the water, skewing the dates. So the team went back. They used totally different dating methods, from the sand grains themselves to ancient pine pollen. In a landmark 2025 paper, they confirmed it. The footprints really are between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. People were here in New Mexico during the absolute peak of the Ice Age. These footprints are a vivid, undeniable snapshot of human life in America nearly 10,000 years before Clovis. While all this was happening, a revolution in genetics was providing a second, independent line of evidence. By studying the DNA of modern and ancient Native Americans, geneticists built a new timeline. A major 2015 study concluded that the ancestors of Native Americans split from Siberian populations around 23,000 years ago, but they didn't come straight to America. They hung out for a few thousand years in the region of the Bering Land Bridge, a period now called the Beringian Standstill. Then, around 16,000 years ago, they started moving south into the continent. The genetics and the archaeology were telling the exact same story. The combined evidence didn't just challenge the old theory. It completely destroyed it. The question was no longer if people were here before Clovis. The questions now were, how on earth did they get here, and who were they? So if they didn't walk through an ice-free corridor, how did the first Americans arrive? The evidence now overwhelmingly points to the ocean. The new leading theory is the coastal migration hypothesis, sometimes called the Kelp Highway. The idea is that the first Americans didn't walk. They paddled. They were a coastal people who traveled in small boats down the Pacific coast. During the Ice Age, sea levels were hundreds of feet lower, exposing a wide coastal plain. This lost coastline was likely lined with rich kelp forests, creating an ecosystem full of fish, seals, and shellfish. It was a prehistoric buffet. These explorers could have hopscotched their way down the coast, moving way faster than anyone could on foot. This theory perfectly explains how people reached Chile so early. It also explains why we haven't found more of these early sites. The coastlines they lived on are now hundreds of feet underwater. This new origin story paints a very different picture of the first Americans. They weren't just mammoth hunters. They were skilled mariners and foragers, incredibly smart and adaptable. But this new story is just the beginning. Because what happened next, in the heart of North America, is perhaps even more shocking. These early peoples would lay the groundwork for a true hidden civilization. When most of us think of ancient American civilizations, we think of the Maya, the Aztec, or the Inca. We picture North America as a land of nomadic tribes. That picture is profoundly wrong. For thousands of years, North America was home to complex societies that built cities, engineered enormous earthworks, and commanded trade networks that spanned the continent. This was the civilization of the mound builders. It started slowly, but around 1000 BCE in the Ohio River Valley, the Adena culture emerged, building hundreds of conical burial mounds that became great ceremonial centers. Around 200 BCE, this evolved into something even more spectacular, the Hopewell tradition. The Hopewell built massive, precise geometric earthworks, huge circles, squares, and octagons aligned perfectly with the sun and moon. They were master artists and traders, gathering obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and copper from the Great Lakes region. But they were just the opening act. Around 800 CE, on the banks of the Mississippi River, the Mississippian culture arose. Its capital was one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a city that, today, almost no one has heard of. It was called Cahokia, located at what is now the Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site in Illinois, just across the river from modern-day St. Louis. At its peak around 1100 CE, Cahokia was bigger than London was at the time, with a population of up to 20,000 people. The city was dominated by something that you can still go and see today, something that is hard to wrap your head around. Monks Mound, a colossal four-terraced mound built by hand, basket by basket of earth. It's over 100 feet tall with a base bigger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. On top of it sat a huge building, the home of Cahokia's powerful ruler. Cahokia had over 120 mounds arranged around huge public plazas. The whole central city was enclosed by a 2-mile-long defensive wall made of giant logs. This was a highly organized city with a clear social hierarchy, vibrant marketplaces, and advanced engineering. They layered different types of soils in their mounds to ensure they would last for 1,000 years. Incredible new research shows just how organized they were. We've learned they could fell a massive 5-ton cypress tree hundreds of miles to the south, float it all the way upriver, and raise it as a huge sacred post in their city. A feat of logistics like that tells you you're looking at a true regional power, on par with other ancient civilizations. Cahokia was a true city, the first in North America. This was America 1,000 years ago. Not an empty wilderness, but a land with a bustling, powerful, and sophisticated urban heart. It is America's great hidden metropolis. For 300 years, Cahokia was the center of its world. But then, around 1350 CE, something went wrong. People started leaving. Within just a few decades, the once thriving metropolis was nearly empty. By 1400, the great city was silent. The collapse of Cahokia is one of North America's greatest mysteries. Why did America's first city die? For years, the popular theory was that they were a victim of their own success, that they cut down too many trees and exhausted the soil with their farming. Another theory blamed climate change and drought. But recent research has cast doubt on that. 2024 study that analyzed soil from the area found no evidence of widespread crop failure right when the city was declining. It seems the Cahokians, being clever engineers, likely had ways to manage drought. So if they didn't starve, what happened? The clues might be in the city itself. That massive wall they built late in the city's life suggests a society under intense pressure. Were they afraid of outside enemies, or was the ruling class afraid of its own people? The system of tribute and labor required to build those magnificent mounds must have been immense. It's very possible this society just broke down from social unrest, political conflict, or a crisis of faith. People may have just voted with their feet and walked away. The truth is, we don't know for sure. It was likely a complex cocktail of factors. By the time Europeans arrived, the city was long gone, its great mounds mistaken for natural hills. The story of America's hidden civilization is a powerful reminder that history is never finished. From 23,000-year-old footprints in New Mexico to the silent grass pyramids of the Mississippi, the ground is revealing a past far deeper and more complex than we ever dreamed. We found the first chapter of a new history of America, but we're only just learning how to read it. The story we were all told about American history was missing a few chapters. The real story doesn't begin 13,000 years ago. It begins at least 10,000 years before that with daring maritime explorers. It builds not to nomadic tribes but to a great urban civilization in the heart of the continent. This is the new, true story of America's ancient past, and it reminds us that the Earth still holds its secrets. And with every new discovery, the human story just gets a little more wondrous. The history of ancient America is being rewritten right now. If you want to explore more of the world's hidden histories with us, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. What lost civilization should we uncover next? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching.